Why would a country facing security pressure, economic strain, and international isolation choose to begin its reforms with sugar? At first glance, sugar seems insignificant. It is not gold, not oil, not uranium. Yet in Mali, and across the Sahel, sugar is a strategic commodity. It touches daily life, religious practice, social stability, and political legitimacy. When sugar is missing, prices rise. When prices rise, frustration follows. And when frustration spreads, governments fall faster than from any military defeat. In early 2025, Mali officially launched its sugar production campaign for the 2025 to 2026 season. The government expects more than 120,000 tons of sugar from two industrial sites, Sucala and N'Sukala. This single figure represents roughly 34% of national consumption. It also represents something deeper, a deliberate shift away from dependence and toward controlled self-reliance. This decision did not emerge in isolation. Mali is moving within a broader political and economic current shaped by the alliance of Sahel states, known as AES, and strongly influenced by the vision of Ibrahim Traore of BURKINAFASO. At the core of this vision lies a simple but disruptive idea. Political sovereignty cannot exist without economic sovereignty. A nation that exports raw materials while importing essential goods remains vulnerable, regardless of its flag or its leaders. Sugar matters because it tests the state's ability to manage society under pressure. Ramadan is not merely a religious period. It is a stress test for governance. Shortages during this time can ignite unrest within days by prioritizing domestic sugar production. Mali is not only producing food, it is producing reassurance, predictability, and political breathing room. This is not a declaration of full independence from global markets. It is a calculated step toward partial control. Mali is not claiming victory. It is claiming direction. The goal is not to eliminate imports overnight, but to reduce exposure, slow capital flight, preserve jobs, and stabilize prices where it matters most. In this video, we will examine why the AES countries are turning toward domestic industry, why sugar has become a strategic symbol, how Mali's approach reflects lessons drawn from Burkina Faso, and what risks remain ahead. More importantly, we will ask a larger question. Is this the beginning of a sustainable path toward African economic self-determination, or merely a pause before a new form of dependency takes hold? For decades, the economies of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have shared a common vulnerability: deep dependence on imported essential goods. Sugar, rice, wheat flour, fuel, and basic food products arrive from distant markets, priced in foreign currencies, transported through fragile logistics corridors. When those corridors break, societies feel the shock immediately. In Mali, national sugar consumption reaches roughly 350,000 tons per year. Before recent reforms, most of this volume was imported. Similar patterns exist across the AES region. Burkina Faso produces only a small share of its own sugar needs. Niger relies on imports for the vast majority of its food staples. This structure leaves governments exposed not only to global price fluctuations, but also to political pressure beyond their borders. Import dependence creates three strategic risks. First, it drains scarce foreign currency reserves. Every shipload of sugar represents capital flowing outward instead of circulating inside the domestic economy. Second, it transfers price control to external actors. A rise in international prices or transport costs becomes domestic inflation overnight. Third, it undermines political stability. When shelves empty or prices spike. Public anger rarely targets distant exporters. It targets the local state, for the AES governments. These risks are not theoretical. Sanctions, Border closures, insecurity, and diplomatic tensions have repeatedly disrupted supply chains in the Sahel. Each disruption reinforces a hard lesson: food security is inseparable from national security. A country that cannot guarantee basic goods in times of stress remains structurally fragile, regardless of military strength. This is why the AES shift toward domestic production focuses first on essential commodities rather than luxury industries. Sugar stands alongside grains and fuel as a priority, not because it generates prestige, but because it stabilizes daily life. When essential goods are locally available, governments gain time, credibility, and room to maneuver. For older generations, this logic is familiar. History shows that inflation and shortages erode regimes faster than speeches or ideology. The AES leadership understands that legitimacy is earned not only through sovereignty rhetoric, but through visible control over basic economic functions. Reducing import dependence does not mean closing borders or rejecting trade. It means correcting an imbalance that has long favored exporters and intermediaries over local producers. By targeting essential imports, the AES countries are attempting to reclaim a measure of control over their economic destiny, beginning with the goods that matter most when systems are under pressure. The sugar industry in Mali did not begin with the current transition government. The two main industrial pillars, Sucala and N'Sukala, have existed for decades and once symbolized national ambition in agro-industrial development. Over time, however, these facilities became burdened by mismanagement, underinvestment, aging infrastructure, and inconsistent state oversight. Production declined, operations slowed, and dependence on imported sugar quietly became the norm. For years, these factories survived in a fragile state. Equipment failures were frequent. Energy supply was unreliable. Commercialization channels were poorly organized, allowing imported sugar to undercut local production. As a result, domestic sugar lost competitiveness, and the industrial base eroded. What remained was not a lack of capacity, but a lack of political will to treat sugar as a strategic sector rather than a residual industry. The 2025 to 2026 production campaign marks a turning point. By relaunching both Sucala and N'Sukala with clear production targets exceeding 120,000 tons, the Malian state has repositioned these factories as instruments of national policy. This output represents roughly one-third of national demand, not enough to replace imports, but sufficient to reshape the balance of power in the market. What matters is not only volume, but control. Domestic production allows the government to influence supply timing, manage reserves, and intervene during sensitive periods. It also restores confidence among workers, farmers, and local communities whose livelihoods depend on the sugar value chain. Sugarcane cultivation, transport, processing, and distribution once again form an integrated economic circuit inside the country. This shift reflects a broader lesson drawn from regional experience. Industrial assets do not fail because they are obsolete. They fail when states abandon them to market forces without strategic protection. Mali's approach does not romanticize state ownership, nor does it reject private participation. Instead, it restores coordination, supervision, and political priority. Sucala and N'Sukala are no longer treated as legacy projects from the past. They are now laboratories for a new industrial logic limited, pragmatic, and focused on essentials. In this sense, the sugar campaign is less about nostalgia and more about redefining what national industry means under conditions of constraint, pressure, and uncertainty. In Mali and across the Sahel, sugar is not a marginal product. It occupies a central place in daily consumption, social customs, and religious life. This becomes most visible during Ramadan, a period when household demand rises sharply and price stability carries political weight. For any government, Ramadan functions as a silent referendum on its capacity to govern. Shortages during this period are not interpreted as technical failures. They are read as signs of weakness. When sugar disappears from markets or becomes unaffordable, frustration accumulates rapidly. Traders are blamed, but responsibility ultimately flows upward to the state. History across West Africa shows that food price shocks during religious periods have triggered protests far out of proportion to the commodity itself. This is why the Malian government's decision to secure sugar production and pre-position reserves before Ramadan carries strategic meaning. By setting aside 25,000 tons of sugar from domestic output, authorities are not merely managing inventory. They are managing expectations. The message is simple: the state is present, prepared, and attentive to social pressure points. Food security, in this sense, cannot be separated from national security. Armies may control territory, but only food controls households. A state that maintains shelves and stabilizes prices preserves social calm even in times of political uncertainty. This understanding reflects a broader Sahelian lesson learned through repeated crises, sanctions, and border disruptions. Domestic sugar production strengthens this capacity by shortening supply chains and reducing exposure to external shocks. Imported sugar must pass through ports, borders, and financial systems that Mali does not control. Locally produced sugar moves faster, responds to policy intervention, and can be redirected in emergencies. This flexibility is crucial when infrastructure is fragile and regional tensions remain high. Ramadan, therefore, becomes more than a religious season. It is a governance test. By prioritizing sugar as a strategic reserve, Mali is practicing preventive stability rather than reactive crisis management. The goal is not abundance, but reliability. Citizens do not demand perfection. They demand predictability. In this context, sugar illustrates a fundamental principle of statecraft under pressure. Stability is built less through declarations than through quiet logistical success. When families can observe continuity in their daily routines, political tensions soften. In Mali's current trajectory, food security has become one of the most effective tools for maintaining social balance while broader economic reforms unfold. Beyond food availability, the revival of domestic sugar production in Mali carries a second strategic function: employment and social anchoring. In societies with young populations and limited industrial bases, steady work is not merely an economic variable. It is a stabilizing force. When factories operate, communities remain rooted. When they close, migration, resentment, and informal survival strategies expand rapidly. The Sucala and N'Sukala sugar complexes directly preserve more than 2,000 industrial jobs. These positions are not symbolic. They provide predictable income, technical skills, and a sense of continuity for families who have depended on the sugar sector for generations. Around these core jobs exists a wider ecosystem: sugarcane farmers, transport workers, maintenance crews, local traders, and service providers all depend on the functioning of the production chain. Industrial employment differs from short-term public works or emergency assistance. It structures time, discipline, and social identity. Workers with stable employment are less vulnerable to recruitment by criminal networks, less inclined toward forced migration, and more invested in social order. From a governance perspective, factories are not only economic assets, they are anchors of social control without coercion. This is why the AES emphasis on domestic industry favors processing and manufacturing rather than raw extraction. Exporting raw materials creates wealth elsewhere while leaving domestic labor underutilized. Processing creates value inside the country and distributes income across multiple layers of society. Even when production costs are higher than imports, the social return can justify the investment. For Mali, sugar production exemplifies this logic. It does not require advanced technology beyond reach. It relies on existing agricultural knowledge, and it produces an output that the domestic market already consumes. This alignment between production and consumption reduces market risk and enhances sustainability. Employment also shapes political legitimacy. Governments that protect jobs earn tolerance during periods of hardship. Citizens may accept shortages or slow reforms if they see tangible efforts to preserve livelihoods. Conversely, job losses magnify every policy error. By restoring activity at Sucala and N'Sukala, Mali is not only producing sugar, it is reinforcing a social contract under strain. The strategy reflects a broader understanding shared across the AES. Stability does not emerge from slogans. It emerges when ordinary people can plan their lives around work, income, and predictable routines, even amid uncertainty. The strategic logic behind Mali's sugar policy cannot be separated from the broader vision articulated by Ibrahim Traore and reflected across the alliance of Sahel states. At the center of this vision lies a clear hierarchy of priorities. Political independence is meaningless without economic control. Economic control is impossible without mastery over essential goods. And stability cannot exist when societies depend entirely on forces they do not command. Ibrahim Traore has consistently framed sovereignty as a practical condition rather than a symbolic one. For him, independence is not measured by speeches or diplomatic alignments, but by whether a nation can feed its population, employ its youth, and withstand external pressure without immediate collapse. This thinking has reshaped policy debates across the AES, pushing leaders to focus on production rather than promises. Within this framework, security is redefined. Military operations address symptoms. Economic structures address causes. Poverty, unemployment, and dependency create fertile ground for instability. By contrast, domestic industry absorbs labor, anchors communities, and reduces exposure to external shocks. Sugar production in Mali fits squarely into this logic. It is not an isolated project, but a component of a wider effort to rebuild economic foundations under constraint. BURKINAFASO serves as a reference point rather than a template. Under Traore's leadership, emphasis has shifted toward local processing, retention of value chains, and resistance to extractive arrangements that benefit external actors more than domestic populations. Mali has adopted this orientation cautiously, adjusting it to its own capacities and risks. The objective is alignment, not imitation. The AES framework amplifies this approach by encouraging coordination rather than competition among vulnerable states. Shared challenges invite shared solutions. When supply chains fracture or sanctions tighten, collective resilience becomes essential. Economic cooperation around essential goods creates a buffer that purely military alliances cannot provide. This vision remains experimental and incomplete. Constraints are severe, resources are limited, mistakes are inevitable. Yet, the strategic direction is clear. By linking sovereignty to production, and production to social stability, the AES leadership is attempting to redefine what independence looks like in practice. Mali's sugar campaign, viewed through this lens, is not a minor agricultural initiative. It is a signal of ideological alignment and strategic intent. It demonstrates how abstract principles are translated into concrete policy, one essential commodity at a time. The shift toward domestic industry within the AES has not gone unnoticed by Western governments and institutions. Reactions have ranged from open criticism to subtle forms of pressure. Public discourse often frames these policies through the lenses of democratic backsliding, governance risks, and fears of new external dependencies. While some concerns are legitimate, the broader picture is more complex than these narratives suggest. One recurring criticism focuses on political freedoms and media restrictions within AES states. Western actors argue that economic sovereignty pursued under military-led governments lacks accountability and risks entrenching authoritarian rule. Others emphasize security outcomes, noting that instability in the Sahel persists despite new alliances. A third line of critique centers on partnerships with non-Western actors, warning that dependency may simply shift rather than disappear. These arguments deserve examination rather than dismissal. No industrial policy succeeds without transparency. No sovereignty project is immune to capture by elites. And replacing one dominant partner with another does not constitute true independence. These risks are real, and ignoring them would undermine the very legitimacy AES leaders seek to build. However, a balanced assessment must also confront the failures of previous models. Decades of externally guided reforms did not produce food security, employment, or stability in the Sahel. Import dependence deepened. Value chains remained externalized. When crises emerged, social systems proved brittle. The current turn toward domestic production is therefore less a rebellion against norms than a response to lived experience. Western discourse often treats economic policy as separate from social survival. In the Sahel, they are inseparable. A government that cannot guarantee basic goods loses authority regardless of constitutional form. From this perspective, industrial revival is not ideological defiance, but risk management. There is also evidence of pragmatic recalibration. While criticism persists, engagement has not ceased. Western actors continue to seek dialogue, recognizing that disengagement would leave strategic vacuums. This implicit acknowledgement strengthens the AES position, provided results materialize on the ground. The lesson for other African countries is neither imitation nor rejection. Domestic industry must be pursued with safeguards, plural partnerships, and measurable outcomes. Sovereignty must be built, not declared. Mali's sugar policy illustrates both the opportunity and the constraint. Success will silence critics more effectively than rhetoric. Failure will validate them. The path forward therefore demands discipline, transparency, and patience. Economic independence is not achieved through confrontation alone, but through steady delivery of stability where it matters most to ordinary citizens. Looking ahead, the direction chosen by Mali and the wider AES opens several possible paths, each carrying distinct costs and consequences. None offer easy victories. What differs is the distribution of risk and control. The first scenario is gradual stabilization through partial self-reliance. Domestic production expands slowly across a limited number of essential goods such as sugar, grains, and basic processing. Imports continue, but no longer dominate. Prices become more predictable. Employment stabilizes. Governments gain time and political space to refine policy. This path does not deliver rapid growth, but it reduces the likelihood of sudden social rupture. For fragile states, this may be the most realistic success. The second scenario is partial success with rising internal pressure. Production increases, but costs remain high. Infrastructure gaps, energy shortages, and management weaknesses strain state finances. Citizens support this strategy in principle, but grow impatient with prices and shortages. Without careful communication and targeted support, legitimacy erodes slowly. This scenario demands disciplined governance and constant adjustment rather than grand declarations. The third scenario is regression. Industrial projects stall. Imports surge back. Dependency deepens under new terms. In this case, the promise of sovereignty becomes a source of disillusionment rather than cohesion. History shows that failed reform is more dangerous than no reform at all, because it exhausts trust. What determines the outcome is not ideology, but execution. Control over essential goods must translate into tangible improvements in daily life. Factories must operate. Prices must remain within reach. Jobs must persist beyond announcements. Sovereignty is judged by results, not intentions. Mali's sugar campaign therefore carries significance beyond its immediate output. It illustrates a governing philosophy rooted in pragmatism. Start with what people consume every day. Build capacity where failure is visible and success is measurable. Accept limits, but insist on direction. For other African countries, the lesson is not to replicate Mali's choices blindly. It is to recognize that dependency is not neutral. Every import carries vulnerability. Every domestic factory carries potential resilience. As this chapter unfolds, one truth remains constant. Stability is not imposed from above, nor imported from abroad. It is constructed quietly through production, work, and reliability. In choosing sugar as a starting point, Mali and its AES partners have revealed how they intend to rebuild sovereignty not through slogans, but through essentials,